Corina Sara van der Wouden was born in Rotterdam, Holland on February 21st, 1922, to parents Cornelia and Peter van der Wouden. In this review of her life, I will call her Grandma, as that is how she is known by most of the people here. And though much of this information is from the distant past, her story, like history, is full of personal and cultural lessons. Grandma was baptized with her family into the Latter-day Saint Church in Holland when she was about 8 years old, maybe around 1931. She lived through the Great Depression in the Netherlands, which occurred between 1933 and 1936 when she was 11 to 14 years old. Most people had no work, no money, and very little food. Grandma got part of her school uniform around age 10 from the government. When they could, Grandma's father, Peter, and her brothers worked as shipbuilders. Grandma remembered when they came home from work, they had bleeding cracks on the backs of their hands from working outside in the cold winter. She remembers them peeing on their hands to disinfect and heal the cuts. It is well known that urine is a useful disinfectant, so they weren't crazy. She lost both her parents at the age of 12. Her mother, Cornelia, passed away first, and shortly after, her father, Peter. She was left with 3 younger sisters, Yalcha, Pietitje, and Frederica, a younger brother, Henny, and 4 older brothers, Gerrit, Jan, Koos, and Kees. Even though the older boys tried to keep the family together for several months after their parents passed away, the family got split up. Grandma and her brothers and sisters had to go live with different people. The younger of the van der Wouden children went to live with various Mormon families. Grandma went to live with a wealthy Mormon family, where she had to quit school and work as a maid, servant, and house cleaner until she turned 18. They didn't let her go to school. Grade 8 was the end of her education. This is pretty well what Grandma did from age 13 until 18, 1936 until 1940. About age 18 in 1940, a lot of things happened. Grandma was allowed to leave that family, and she got a job in a sewing factory. She went to live with her brothers again for a while, but it was hard to get them together because they had been apart and they hardly knew each other. She also worked as a waitress, and she was in Holland when the Germans used guns and bombs to kill a lot of citizens of Holland and march into their country and take over everything in May of 1940. During the German occupation, Grandma had to serve food to the German soldiers, while most of the Dutch people, except the very rich, were starving to death. In the last 6 months of the war, the Dutch people's food rations got as low as 2 slices of bread per day. When she brought the German soldiers' plates back to the kitchen, if there were a couple of peas left there, she would eat them, or a piece of potato, or whatever. This is how she survived, while she saw a lot of Dutch people starve to death in the streets. Interestingly, recent science has shown that when people are always a little bit hungry, when they never eat as much as they want to eat, these people are healthier and live longer. It's called caloric restriction, and Grandma Cassell's long life, after years of not getting enough food, is something we might be able to learn from when we consider how much we should be eating in order to be healthy. As she lived through the war, she saw the Germans, who she did refer to as Germans and not Nazis, literally come and get and forcibly take away her Jewish neighbors.
With the surrender to Germany came appointment of not a military but a civilian governor or Reichskommissar. He was an Austrian lawyer known for his brutal efficiency in imposing Hitler's ideal of racial purity. His civil government background meant that control of the population would be much easier. Census, birth, and tax records made locating Amsterdam's Jews relatively easy. His rule was by military decree. Escape from German scrutiny was almost impossible. Holland is flat, with no natural hiding places, bounded by open sea to the west and north, German troops to the east, and German-occupied Belgium to the south. The immediate reaction of Amsterdam's citizens was to demonstrate and protest anti-Jewish measures. German reaction was swift and ruthless. A famous civil uprising was the dock workers' strike of February 1941 by dockers and transit workers against treatment of Jews. Resistance workers distributed pamphlets shaming those who stood by and did nothing to stop the wholesale Nazi roundup of Jews. Reprisals were swift and brutal and brought a quick halt to overt demonstrations against Nazi civil rule. March 1941, Germans began to take over or Arenize Jewish property. April 1941, the Dutch population is issued German ID cards. July 1941, Jews are required to have a large J stamped on their ID cards. August 1941, Jewish children may no longer attend public schools or trade schools. A wholesale roundup and confiscation of all Jewish savings, assets, and securities is undertaken. Only 250 guilders a month or less is made available to Jewish owners of the confiscated assets. January 1942, forced labor camps for Jews are constructed. May 1942, Jews must wear a yellow star sewn to their clothing with the word Jew on it. All Jews must observe an 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew. Jews may only shop between 3 and 5 p.m. Jews may not have telephones. The German government grants itself authority to seize all Jewish private property, except wedding rings and gold teeth. July 1942, wholesale deportation of Jews from Holland begins. 2 concentration camps are built in Holland, with Westerbork camp outside of Amsterdam. From here, Jews are shipped to death camps, primarily Auschwitz. September 1943, a final major roundup of 5,000 Jews, including the Jewish Council, are all sent to Westerbork.
One time, her brother-in-law, Emil, was standing on the street, and the German soldiers asked him if he was Jewish and if he had any Jewish relatives in the last 4 generations. And he had to tell the truth because apparently all these kind of things were kept in detailed records in Holland at the time. Well, he didn't. But if he did, they would have taken him away to the work camps, which were really death camps, that most people never came back from.
This is the only surviving film documentation of the deportation trains. The Dutch Jews thought they were being relocated for deployment as laborers because they were allowed to bring some of their belongings with them. They traveled in freight cars, men, women, and children, and even babies, for days and weeks, sometimes without food and water. Every one of the 34 trains went to Sobibor. A few were later sent on to Majdanek. The SS doctors Rindfleisch and Blanke performed the selection when the trains arrived at Majdanek.
Grandma personally saw from her second-floor apartment window the Germans dragging her Jewish neighbors off the street and into the back of a black wagon and whisking them off to death camps. One of her 4 brothers, Case, was conscripted by the Germans to work in the camps in Germany. Just as the German soldiers were arriving at the house to take Case away, Grandma's oldest brother, Garrett, arrived home from his work in the shipyards. In a selfless expression of brotherly love reminiscent of a scene from the Hunger Games where Katniss volunteers to replace her younger sister being forced into the games, Grandma's older brother, Garrett, offered to take the place of her younger brother, Case, because Case had just gotten married. So though Case had been conscripted to go to Germany, it was Garrett who actually they took to Germany to work. But as war would have it, later on, the Germans came back and they took Case anyway. Fortunately, unlike most people taken in the Hunger Games, both brothers did come back to Holland after the war. Grandma also witnessed a heroic wartime act by her Dutch sister-in-law, Case's wife, Christina. When Case and Garrett were in Germany doing forced work for the Germans, Christina, at tremendous risk to her own life, took in a baby Jewish girl, Ellie, to hide it from certain death at the hands of the Germans. Though baby Ellie's parents disappeared and were never seen again, baby Ellie survived, thanks to Christina, and lived a normal life. Like other heroes who saved Jewish people, Case and Christina were publicly honored in their later years. Imagine the kind of stress Grandma and the family was living under on a daily basis during these years. In 1945, when the war ended, Canadian and Allied soldiers were honored by Dutch families. Grandma remembers the massive celebrations in the streets, thanking the soldiers for removing the invading murderers. The Allied soldiers were treated to the best food and drink. And guess who was one of those Allied soldiers? Grandma's future husband, Don Cassell. But as fate would have it, Don did not meet Grandma at this time. He would have to wait a few more years before meeting the woman of his life.
We love Grandma Dorothy. We love Grandma Cassell. We love Grandma Mary too. We love our grandmas 'cause they treat us kind. Their smiling faces are the best you'll find. When they visit us, we wish they'd stay. 'Cause when they giggle with us, what more need we say? We love our grandmas 'cause we have such fun. They make us feel so good, we play and run. They read us stories and we sure don't mind. And the hugs and kisses make a lasting bond. We love our grandmas, we love our grandmas, we love our grandmas every day. We love our grandmas, we love our grandmas, we love our grandmas every day. Maybe I should sing that higher.
We like diamonds and we like pearls, but we know grandmas are the sweetest girls, so come on. So come on. So come on. Come on.
After the war, at age 23 to 28, which was 1945 to 1950, Grandma worked as a seamstress at a sewing factory in Amsterdam. She walked or took the streetcar to work every day. She was also the pianist and the organist at her LDS church. No one seems to know where she learned to play the piano, but she was really good at it. She played beautiful pieces by Beethoven and others. During this period after the war, most of her brothers and sisters moved to Salt Lake City, Utah, because that's where the only LDS temple was located. But one of her sisters, Petitia, became a war bride by marrying a Canadian soldier in Holland who took her back to his hometown in Toronto, Canada. When Grandma finally left Holland for Utah, she also went to Toronto for what she thought was a stopover to visit her sister and her family. When Grandma was visiting her sister, then she didn't speak English, but Grandma was able to get a job in a sewing factory. It was during that visit to her sister that she met a Canadian war vet in Toronto who was visiting his sister, who lived in another suite in the same apartment building. This Canadian vet was described as a rough and tough Canadian soldier and sailor who had just returned home after 4 years of sailing and living in Australia after the war. His name was Don Cassell, and this is how, despite the close encounter in Holland 4 years earlier, this is how they finally met. So instead of going to Utah or marrying within the LDS Church, she stayed in Toronto and married Don Cassell. They got married in 1950. They had 4 children in Toronto: Juanita, Donita, Robert, and Donald. For 1 year, they also had Grandma's 15-year-old nephew Paul living with them, whom they rescued from a farm where he was being overworked and underfed. Eventually, drawn by Grandma's family ties, after 12 years of living in Toronto, the whole family boarded a train to Utah just before Christmas in 1962. The family lived in Utah for about a year. But besides missing Canada, Don was working illegally in the United States. So Grandma and he made the decision to drive the family up into Vancouver to escape the U.S. authorities. Don, on the run from the law, with Grandma at his side, made their way back with 4 kids in their 1951 Pontiac through a driving December snowstorm to the safe haven of Canada. What an adventure. They had been planning to go back to Toronto in the spring, but Grandma liked it so much living in Vancouver because it was closer to Utah and probably other things about Vancouver. So the Vancouver area became the choice for the place for her to continue raising her family. She liked the easy access to her brothers and sisters in Utah, and she frequently took the bus to visit them as she raised her own family in Vancouver, Burnaby, and Chilliwack. During these child-raising years, 1961 to 1975, Grandma worked off and on as a seamstress and a gardener. She also worked at Fraservale Farms on the production line, processing broccoli, cauliflower, and strawberries, which, by the way, modern nutritional science has discovered are extremely healthy foods. Since the time she got married, she was not an active Mormon, but she always had some contact with the church, inviting missionaries to play basketball in the street and teach her children how to make cornbread, which led to several conversions and new members. While raising her children, she saved a lot of money by doing her own sewing, knitting, and crocheting. She made curtains, bedspreads, throw pillows for the couches, pillowcases, scarves, hats, sweaters, blankets. She knew a variety of different stitches. When her sheets wore out, she would cut out the center parts of the sheets and use the edges to make pillowcases. The family really appreciated how she kept their clothes smelling fresh with her frequent use of the laundry, though they sometimes say that her own hands smelled like bleach. At this time in her life, she could also be found helping her husband Don in the garden, or riding her bicycle to visit her neighbors in Chilliwack. In the early 70s, Grandma became a grandmother and frequently visited her grandchildren in Vancouver, Aldergrove, and Langley. Though not very social, she was always friendly to neighbors and good with money, doing the income tax returns for family members. And she was generous with money, helping her kids out when they needed it. She lent Donita part of the money to buy her first car, and she lent other kids money when they needed it. When her daughters were teenagers in Chilliwack, she and Dawn took in Grandma's two nieces, Leona and Yvonne, from Toronto for a couple of years, who shared bedrooms with her own children, Donita and Juanita. Grandma was always supportive of the teenage friends of her children, feeding them generously when they came for overnight visits. She called all her kids' friends Flip if they were boys and Susie if they were girls, because she couldn't remember their names. Grandma wouldn't hesitate with a hug when her teenage kids' girlfriends visited. Most of the teenagers called her Mom, but she could also be firm with them. She would discipline them to take their shoes off at the door by threatening, "I'll give you a clop de coupe," which apparently means slap on the head. Almost everything she cooked was Dutch. She always cooked in a Dutch oven. When she made meat, she made Dutch oven meat. She made boterkoek, which is Dutch butter cake, like a shortbread, and stomppot, called that because you had to stomp it in the pot when you made it. It is actually potatoes cooked with sauerkraut and a ring of German wurst. Wurst is a type of sausage on top of it, mashed up with butter and salt and fried onions. Sounds really good, except for the sausage. Maybe we'll try it sometime. On New Year's Eve, she made oliebollen, which is oil balls, which is a Dutch traditional donut like dough, which is deep fried, but it wasn't donuts, it was in balls. And they roll them in a special kind of sugar, like icing sugar, but it has a colder taste to it. She used to buy Dutch spice cake and Dutch spice speculoos cookies at Dutch stores or delicatessens, wherever she could find them. And she always gave her kids and grandkids lots of droppies. Salted licorice. Salted licorice in the shape of animals, people, and windmills. Throughout Grandma's life, she walked a lot. She took the bus, but she never drove a car. More recently, doctors have discovered that walking regularly is actually very healthy. If it wasn't the caloric restriction of her earlier years, perhaps it was the walking that gave her such a long life. When Grandma got a bit older and was walking less, she would often buy marshmallows for the grandchildren because the Dutch deli was too far away for her to get the real Dutch treats. This led to her being called Grandma Marshmallow by the great-grandchildren. In her later years, when she had difficulty getting out, it was her who would, or it was she, her or she, it was she or her who would enjoy Dutch treats brought to her by grandchildren and grandchildren. Instead of her bringing them the Dutch treats, they would bring her the Dutch treats. Or she, sorry. Since playing the piano with the LDS Church in her youth, she continued to play during her final years at the rest home on Salt Spring Island. She will be missed by all who knew her. Thank you.